Hey guys, it's Thomas, and today I want to talk about controlling algae because let's face it, it's one of the most common issues that we have as aquarists. The presence of algae can be unsightly and gross. Although it's not usually harmful, it is something we want to get rid of. So here are 10 ways you can combat algae. Number one is probably a little obvious, but it's manual removal. Whether you're using a sponge or an algae scraper, or if it's something like hair algae, pinching it off with your fingers, removing algae manually before doing anything else to try and prevent further growth is really important. The reason it's important is because the more algae you have in your tank, the faster it's going to replicate and make more of itself. So getting rid of as much as possible first and then taking other preventative measures is your best course of action to making sure it doesn't come back. Number two, also super important, usually at the beginning of setting up a tank, make sure your aquarium doesn't get any direct sunlight. If your aquarium gets direct sunlight, the algae will grow like crazy, kind of like it's in some kind of overdrive. And that's because, like all plants on our planet, algae is evolved to use the sun to grow. So our aquarium lights, they're not quite like the sun. They're not as strong as the sun. The spectrum's a little off. The sun is the sun, and it's going to make stuff grow like mad. And algae is one of those things. So no direct sunlight. Indirect sunlight is even a little but if you have problems with sunlight on your tank, get some blinds, blackout blinds or blackout curtains, and solve that problem. You'll be one step further to algae ridification. Number three, you can reduce your photo period. Now, what does that mean? What you can do if you have an algae outbreak is try to reduce the amount of time your aquarium light is on the aquarium. Sometimes we get really bright aquarium lights because, let's face it, they look great on the tank. It makes everything in the tank glow and really stand out. But what that means is you're probably putting a lot more light into the aquarium than you actually need, unless you have live plants. And that extra light is going to fuel algae to grow. So what you can do is make sure that your photo period is shorter, so the amount of light per day is less, and the algae has less of an opportunity to utilize that light to grow. So the average person is probably going to put their tank on sometime in the morning before they go to work, and maybe sometime in the evening when they get back. That can be as long as 12 hours. And that's a lot more than you need. Most aquariums will be just fine with around 6 to 8 hours, and you can even go less. If the ambient room light is not pitch black, the fish will get the idea that it's daytime just from the ambient room light, and that means you can save the actual aquarium light time for time you're home to enjoy it. So if you're not going to be able to enjoy it in the morning, leave the aquarium light off and have it turn on when you get home in the evening. Maybe it's 6 o'clock, and then for when you go to bed, 9 o'clock. That's 3 hours. It's a lot less time, which means a lot less algae. If you have live plants or live corals, this method won't work as well because your plants and corals are going to need X amount of light at X amount of intensity during the day in order to thrive. So be very careful with messing with your photo period if you have corals or plants. Number four, a lot like reducing photo period, you can reduce the light intensity. This works really well with something like dimmable LEDs. In this day and age, we have access to a lot of really cool light fixtures that get super bright a lot of the time because we want to keep live plants or corals or something. But those of us without those live plants or corals often get these fixtures because they make the tank look awesome. The problem is if you leave them running full blast, that's a ton of light, the algae's going to use it, and it's going to grow like mad. So what I suggest is try turning the fixture down to about 50%. That will definitely help the amount of growth you're getting out of your algae. It should reduce it, and therefore you will have less algae in the aquarium, and that's a good thing. So if you can reduce light intensity, give it a shot. It'll probably work. Just keep in mind when you mess with the intensity of the light, if you have live plants or corals that rely on that light, you don't want to ever bring the light past the threshold where they're going to thrive. Algae may be thriving with them, but there's other things we can do to combat the algae if you have live plants and corals. So be careful with that and keep watching because we're going to mention some other stuff. Number five, if you have fluorescent lights on your tank, which let's face it, a lot of us do. It's been a staple for so many years, right up until LEDs came out, and things are kind of shifting that way, but a lot of us still have T5 high output, for instance. Fluorescent bulbs over their lifetime will slowly shift in spectrum as they get closer to burning out. And a lot of us wait till they burn out before we replace them, because Why would you replace them before that? Well, I'll tell you why. Because as they shift in spectrum, oftentimes that shift is in the favor of photosynthesis for algae, which means the algae can now use those old bulbs to grow a lot more efficiently than when they were new, which sounds counterintuitive, but it's the truth. So when your bulbs are starting to get a little close to the edge, you'll know because the manufacturer usually gives you recommendations on when to replace them. You should actually replace them, because they could be the reason that you have algae problems now that you didn't have before. So change those bulbs. The tank is going to look a lot better once you change them too. It's kind of like, it's like you have a new fixture because they're like so much brighter and the right spectrum, and things will look great. So 2 reasons. Kill algae, look great. Number 6, a blackout. Just like reducing the lighting, whether it's through photoperiod or intensity, we can go one step further and do what's referred to as a blackout on the aquarium, where we turn off the lights for a few days, usually 48 hours to 72 hours, and then cover the tank, whether it's with black plastic garbage bags or really thick blankets, something that will not allow any light to get into the tank. Cover it up completely and just let it simmer. Obviously, you still want to feed your fish and make sure everything's going great with the rest of it, but the complete lack of lighting will really mess up the algae and prevent it from being able to grow any further. It'll also actually kill off quite a bit of algae. Algae doesn't do well if it doesn't get light for a prolonged period of time. More complex organisms like plants and corals, they can do just fine with 48 hours of absolutely no light. It'll mess up their circadian rhythm a little bit. However, they're not going to perish from it, but the algae will. Just keep in mind, if you do have live plants and corals, 48 hours is the max, and you don't want to do that more than once every 2 weeks. The blackout is really kind of a last-ditch effort when handling the lighting to try and combat algae. There's other things we can do first, and we're going to look at some of those too. Number 7, you can get a cleanup crew to deal with your algae. That can consist of things like snails, shrimps, saltwater. You could be looking at things like sea hares, which are essentially sea slugs, and crabs as well, like emerald crabs. Using a cleanup crew to help deal with algae in the aquarium is one of the most effective ways that you can stop algae from getting out of hand. A lot of the time, you'll add a cleanup crew when you start your tank, whether it's saltwater or freshwater, and then they'll always be there to help kind of keep algae at bay. In freshwater tanks, it's a little less prevalent, and people don't usually get a cleanup crew right away. They wait until there's a problem and then get one. I advocate as soon as you start experiencing any algae in the tank, right near the beginning, you can add something like nerite snails to help deal with it. You can also add a mono shrimp or cherry shrimp, as long as you don't have fish that are gonna pick on them, to also deal with things like hair algae. They work great for planted tanks where you're gonna get a lot of extra algae in a freshwater setting. And then for saltwater, like I mentioned, sea hares, emerald crabs, trocus snails are one of my absolute favorite, along with turbo snails, but there's a whole whack. They're definitely an asset, and I think every tank can benefit from having a cleanup crew. Number 8, in keeping it in line with critters for the tank, fish. There are all kinds of fish that are going to help reduce the algae in your aquarium. One of the most commonly known ones is plecos or plecostomus. People really like to get plecos, usually common plecos, to try to combat algae. I will say though, common plecos get very large, and a much better idea would be a bushy nose or ancistrus pleco. They stay much, much, much smaller, and they actually do a really good job of eating algae, especially while they're young. You can also get fish like Siamese algae eaters, flying foxes. You can also get Chinese algae eaters, and they're really going to help keep the glass clean, ornaments clean. Autocinklus catfish, which are really tiny, will do a great job of keeping algae off of plant leaves. So you have lots of options for freshwater. For saltwater fish, all kinds of tangs are great algae eaters. Rabbit fish are also fantastic algae eaters. And you got some options here, and you can use them. You can have fish for more than just their looks. They can also provide utility, and having them in the tank will also really help you prevent having crazy algae outbreaks. Do not overfeed your fish. This is something that we can all fall victim to because it's really easy to feed your fish all the time or feed them way too much, because feeding our fish is one of the easiest ways for us to interact with them, and let's face it, it brings us pleasure to see them just nibbling there at the surface. You're like, oh, here you go. And they're like, and it's a lot of fun. But if you feed too much, they're gonna poop a lot more, and if you put too much food in at once during those overfeedings, some of that food's gonna just go to the bottom and break down, which is not good. It's gonna lead to having higher levels of phosphate, nitrate, and other basically sources of food for algae. So the more you feed can end up turning into the more algae you have. So being very careful about how much you feed and keeping it within reason is really gonna help keep algae at bay. And number 10, reduce the amount of phosphates, nitrates, silicates, and other forms of nutrients in the aquarium. If you've already been overfeeding your fish like we just talked about, those nutrients are already there. So we gotta get rid of them. And even if you don't overfeed your fish, sometimes those nutrients can build up anyways just because certain types of food may have more phosphates or nitrates. Sometimes we lose fish in the tank, unfortunately, and we never recover the body and they decompose, etc. So what you can do to reduce the amount of nutrients in the tank is use certain types of filter media like ferric oxide or ChemiPure Elite or RoaPhos. There's all kinds of phosphate, nitrate, and silicate reducing media you can put in your filter to pull out the nutrients that the algae are using that are already there and then dispose of it. You can also do the most obvious thing, which is water changes. A lot of the mulm and detritus that builds up in the gravel, you're gonna wanna take that out too, because over time it's just gonna break down further and further and it's gonna fuel algae. So while you're doing your water change, get your gravel siphon, clean everything up, get it out of there, and you're gonna help reduce the amount of algae that's in the aquarium. If you do this along with all the other things that I mentioned, you're gonna have a pretty successful time keeping algae out of the tank. And that's what we want. We want crystal clear water, okay? And we want to have beautiful fish, and we don't want any green muck on the glass or ornaments or anywhere else getting in the way of that. I know there's people out there right now wondering why I haven't brought up UV clarifiers. And I'll throw them in as a bonus. If you have green water specifically, so you look at your water through the side of your tank and it just looks green. It's a foggy green mess in there. A UV clarifier will do a fantastic job at keeping green water from popping up ever again and reducing green water to crystal clear water. The reason I didn't really add it to this list is UV sterilizers can be a little bit pricey, and they're only, in my opinion, really effective at getting rid of green water. Algae that's growing on surfaces, it's not really gonna do much for that. So I wanted to make sure that this list comprised of things that you can utilize to kind of like combat all algae issues in the aquarium, true algae, not bacterial algae or anything like that. So that's what this list is, and there's your bonus. UV clarifier, green water only. There are lots and lots of ways you can combat algae because there are lots and lots of different types of algae out there, and you can kill it with various things or remove it or this, that, and the other. But I couldn't go through everything, so I gave you the most consistent, most broad application list of algae combating tools I could think of. But I'd like to hear what you do to combat algae, the kinds of algae you face, and the things you did to eradicate them. Drop those down in the comment section below. And also, don't forget to check out our Instagram, because we have one of those, and it's full of pretty things. And subscribe, because if you don't subscribe to our YouTube channel, you won't know when the next video comes out. And then you'll be left wondering. You'll be at work one day just like, is the next video out? I don't even know. And then you'll be worried all day and unproductive. So just subscribe and make sure you're productive at work. And also keep on tanking. Tanking algae-free. Super important, because algae is not the thing we tank for, it is the thing that tries to get in the way of our tanking. And we can make sure it goes away and then tank on into the sunset, which is where I like to go lately. The sunset, like where the sun and the water meet, and then it makes that beautiful, like in The Little Mermaid. Okay. It's sometimes green, sometimes black, sometimes blue. Sometimes me, sometimes you. We all experience algae at one point or another, and we usually get frustrated by it, not because it's super harmful for aquariums. Number 5, something else made a noise.